Our lecture today is going to be on Italy in the 14th century. And this is one of my favorite lectures to give because if you're in my Survey 1 class, this is the last lecture of the semester. If you're in my Survey 2 class, it's the first lecture of the semester. It's a really pivotal time in art history. And most importantly, it opens up the door to us for the Italian Renaissance. So I want to tell you a little bit about exactly what the Renaissance is. And the name Renaissance translates from the Italian word Rinascimento, which means rebirth. And that's exactly what this time period is. It's a rebirth of both knowledge and learning as civilization emerges from the Dark or Middle Ages. So basically throughout our history, we kind of have this ebb and flow of artistic creation. We start in prehistory, and we reach a pinnacle during the classical age of the Greek and Roman Empire. And then we fall into the Dark Ages for 900 to 1,000 years, and we're re-emerging at this time into the Renaissance. It's an amazing time in the development of both the arts and the sciences. It's the time where classical antiquity merges with Christian devotion. So we need to know when the Renaissance occurred. And the time period for that, in rough years, is 1300 to 1600. Now, we can break down those centuries into very clean marks. The 1300s, we call the early Renaissance. The 1400s, that's the middle Renaissance. And the 1500s is the late or high Renaissance. We also need to know where the Renaissance occurred. And of course, it occurred all over Europe. But we find the most incredible works emerging from Italy. We're going to start our tour today in the city of Padua, which is in the upper right-hand corner of Italy. You can see the cursor, it's right here next to Venice. Then we have the city of Florence, which will be the mainstay during the 1400s. Rome, and Venice. So who is involved with the Renaissance? Imagine an era where some of the greatest individuals to have ever walked the earth are living and working. These are people we all know, such as Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, the sculptor Donatello. So we've covered all the Ninja Turtles already. Then we have the painter Botticelli, Martin Luther, Machiavelli, Christopher Columbus, and even our friend Galileo, all alive during the Renaissance age. So a lot of people ask me, like, if I had a time machine, would I go back to the Renaissance to walk around? And the answer is absolutely not. This is really a horrible time to be alive, and it's amazing we got such great material from this time period. Europe itself does not exist as it does today. There is no unified political system. In fact, Italy is comprised of loosely aligned city-states, and while they may speak the same language, they each have a different dialect. This is a male-dominated society. We have religious persecution, constant warfare, famines, floods, and we can't forget disease. During the Renaissance, the plague is the most severe disease that's going to strike about every 10 years. But every century, there's a major outbreak. In 1348, this happened, and over half of the population of Europe was killed. In Florence, the situation was much worse. Nearly 80% of that city's population is wiped out. And this artwork exemplifies the idea of the plague. This is in the Campo Santo on the exterior wall, and you have a tin roof over the top of it. When you look at the image itself, you've got some coffins in the lower left-hand corner. Those people have died of the plague. You've got some people on horseback to the right of that. They have handkerchiefs in front of their faces. And at the very center of the work are two angels holding up a scroll which reads basically that the only way to salvation is through the church. So here's a detail. And sadly, the Camposanto's roof caught fire, and the tin got so hot that it melted. The hot tin fell against the fresco paintings here and literally melted them off of the wall. There's been major restoration work done, and this is what it looks like today. There's still some work to do, but it's highly improved. And this is the Church of Santa Trinita. And when we go inside, it's this altarpiece that people come to see. It's absolutely gigantic. It measures in at over 12 feet in height, and it's by the artist Cimabue, who is the very last of the Byzantine artists. We're going to be taking a look at a lot of altarpieces during the Renaissance, so I want to tell you how they're broken down. First, of course, they are created on wood, and particularly poplar wood. The next level is gesso, which is a mixture of chalk and glue, and it serves as basically a priming agent for the wood. It also provides a very luminescent and smooth surface on which to paint. Level C is the underdrawing, the idea of what we're going to be putting on the altarpiece. Then we would attach the gold leaf, particularly either on the background, but more importantly around the heads of the individuals that have religious background. Then the grisaille level, which is gray values. It's how light or how dark we want an object to be. And then the completed painting is finished with tempera paint. So there is a difference between tempera paint and tempura. So there's only one letter difference, and I can't tell you how many times students have written papers saying that this artist is using tempura. They are not. They're definitely using tempera paint. So tempera is created from a mixture of pigment and egg yolk. Why didn't these early Renaissance artists use oil paint? Well, it hadn't been invented yet. It's not going to be invented until the 1420s in Northern Europe. So by the time it gets to Italy, it's almost around the year 1500. Tempera has been used as a painting medium since the late Roman Empire. This is the medium that's going to be on all those illuminated manuscripts, for instance. As we saw in the previous slide, it is traditionally painted on wood panels that are first treated with a product called gesso. And here are a few altarpieces that are in situ. And in situ means that these are in the original locations where they had been set. Very few altarpieces are like this today. Most of the time, they've either been moved into a gallery or into a museum, and they're not existing in their original positions. Here, at the work at the right, this is up in Venice, and this is the Santa Maria dei Ferrari. And just to give you an idea of height, that altarpiece there is 22 feet high. So you're looking at probably 60 to 70 foot tall in that altar area. Now, Giotto is the artist of this work, and it's very similar to the last one by Cimabue that we looked at, but Giotto is also the very first artist of the Renaissance. That's what we consider him to be. When we look at these works next to one another, and here it is in the Uffizi Gallery, again, to give you an idea of the height of this work, it's a little bit smaller. It's about 10.5 foot compared to Cimabue at 12 foot to the left. But we see a totally vast difference in between these two works. And what I'd like you to do here is to go ahead and stop the video, take a look and consider these two works side by side, and jot down a lot of the differences that you see, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about them. Alright, now that you've had a moment to look at the differences between these two works, we're going to point out some of the things that are most important. One of the things that my students normally do is they point out the color differences between the two. The one at the right just seems to pop. But keep in mind that a lot of times in these images that we see, these are stock photos. And the one at the left is not a very good photo. So don't consider color too much of the importance here. What's important more than that is the way that space is depicted. In the work at the right, look at how many angels and saints that we have in that image surrounding the throne. Off to the left, we do have a lot of angels on either side, but they're very flat, very frontal. They're pushed toward the very edge of this work. And they look as if they're basically standing on ladders, one behind the other. The scene at the left is completely flat. When we look at the Madonna, it looks like she's about to slide off of the throne. And that's what we tend to see a lot of in the paintings of the late Gothic and also what we consider the Byzantine time period. In the work at the right, look at how the angels are just focused on the Madonna. This is a technique called line of sight, and basically where everyone else in the work is looking, it's going to direct you, the viewer, to that point as well, really establishing a very firm focal point. In Cimabue's work at the left, the angels are just kind of looking all over the place. We also have accessibility to the Madonna. In Cimabue's work, we have to walk over Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Off to the right, we've got a stairway where we can go up to the Madonna and she can come back down to us. We can apply the term hieratic scale or hierarchical scale to both of these works, meaning that the Madonna is supersized. She is 3, 4, 5 times larger than any of the other angels around her, and she's in a sitting position. Can you imagine if she stood up, how tall she would be? And finally, when we look at this work, we have to consider how the figures themselves look. Giotto is a much more three-dimensional composition of the figures, whereas Cimabue is rather flat and two-dimensional. We have this term called mimesis, which means to replicate or to reproduce. And during the Renaissance, it's important that artists reproduce nature. And we'll see that continuing on, particularly during the 15th century. Artists were gauged on how well they could capture nature. So in terms of awarding the prize for mimesis, it has to be the work here at the right. So the relationship between these two artists is that of teacher and student. In Tuscany, it is said that Cimabue was walking one day and he comes across this kid who is tending sheep. And he's drawing also with such incredible accuracy. Cimabue stops and they start talking. And Cimabue basically talks Giotto into coming to work for his workshop, becoming an apprentice. The time period between these two works is about 20 years. And so we see basically a handoff in terms of artistic prowess from Cimabue to Giotto, and Giotto becomes our very first famous artist of the Renaissance. Now, the best works surviving from Giotto are in the Arena Chapel in Padua. And the Arena Chapel is called that because it is built on the site of an ancient Roman arena. And we are lucky to have this building today at all because during World War II, a bomb was dropped and barely missed hitting this building. So when we go inside, we have 37 separate scenes that correlate with the life of Christ, the life of the Virgin, and also when we're at the altar looking toward the entrance door there, we have This is the Last Judgment. This is just a breakdown of all the different scenes. And when we look at some of the most famous works, I'll show you some of the really great indicating factors that make these works stand out. In the meeting of Joachim and Anna, one of the most important things that we have here is interaction between individuals. the true showing of emotion, which has not happened in literally 1,000 years in art. When we look back at the late Dark Ages, the Gothic period, we get even figures, sculptural figures on the outside of churches that coalesce in terms of stories, but they're just kind of very distant from one another, kind of like that altarpiece we saw by Cimabue. The figures are there, but they don't really acknowledge each other's presence, and definitely there's no to very little emotion being shown. Another of the more famous images is the Adoration of the Magi, and this is one of my favorites because of the way that Halley's Comet is rendered here as the Star of Bethlehem. Halley's Comet is passing the Earth in 1305, the exact time that Giotto is painting the interior of the Arena Chapel. So I thought that was a great choice to incorporate in his work. You'll also see that none of these figures here cast any shadows, and we're not going to have a relatively stable light source for paintings throughout this century. In the Kiss of Judas, we can again see the very flatness of these figures and of this scene. Even though Giotto makes an attempt at three-dimensionality, we are still quite a while away yet from true linear perspective scenes, and also the idea of chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro is a technique invented during the 1400s that is this gradual change in value to make a figure look more three-dimensional. And we have the Crucifixion along with the Lamentation. And with the Lamentation, we have this great kind of ridge or rocks against the background that lead us right to the focal point of the faces of Mary and Christ. Up above, we have this set of angels, and you'll see them a lot of times depicted on Christmas cards separately rather than as a part of this larger scene. And when we take a closer look at the angels, we can see that they're filled with emotion, much different than the angels that are holding up the throne in Cimabue's altarpiece. And one last image before we leave the Arena Chapel is the Last Judgment. And this is also the last image that you see when you exit the church. So we've got this wonderful scene of heaven. We have Christ surrounded by a full body halo called a mandorla. And we have heaven very organized in very tight rows of saints and angels. Down below in the earthly realm, we have the saved to Christ's right, which is our left. And again, they are all lined up. And then the damned are on the other side. Just below Christ, we have the crucifixion. And at the very base of the cross, we have this detail image that I brought up on the right-hand side here of the screen. And this shows Enrico Scrovini, who is the person who patronized Giotto. He's the one who paid Giotto to create the paintings within the chapel. He's offering the chapel to the Virgin Mary. And this is in an attempt to atone for his sins that he committed. Basically, he's buying his way into heaven. It's very similar to buying an indulgence from the Pope or the Church itself. And this was a very common practice during the Renaissance, where we would find perhaps the patron of the work or even the artist, his persona, in this type of image, where it's at the Adoration, the Annunciation, the Last Judgment, in some type of biblical setup. And again, this is Enrico Scrovini, and he is the one who owned this property, and he's the one who paid Giotto to create these paintings. So the Arena Chapel is painted in what's called fresco painting. And fresco is the Italian word for fresh. And this refers to the fresh plaster that is applied to the walls or the ceiling just prior to painting. So in the morning, your assistants would prepare the fresh plaster and apply it to the walls. And then you would have what's called a spolvero or a cartoon, which is a preliminary drawing, basically. It's what the artist is planning to paint. and that would be placed on top of the wet plaster wall. There would be a way of transferring the image to the wall itself, and then that would be taken down and thrown away, and the artist would be basically working from that type of outline transfer to the wall. The pigments themselves are emulsified in lime water, and the liquid paint is applied then to the wet plaster. Once the plaster dries, the paint becomes part of the wall or the ceiling and lasts as long as the structure does. So it's a very permanent type of paint. Fresco painting is usually done during the summer months because that's when the plaster is going to dry correctly. It is never done during cold weather, especially during the winter. Like with any other form of painting, you want to paint from the top down in order to prevent dripping on already completed parts. You do have a limited color palette because not all colors are going to be water soluble. And fresco painting is so boring. It is very slow, it is methodical. You have to literally move from left to right, top to bottom, just like you're reading a book. A full-sized figure is going to take about 2 days to paint, and that's if you're moving at a pretty rapid pace. We also have to consider the work environments of fresco painters. Now, first off, fresco painters were looked at as the very best painters. This is really where the most famous works are going to be done in this medium. A lot of times you're going to be up on a scaffold. It's very dangerous to be up on a scaffold because you may be 40 feet from the floor of a church or a chapel. And many times an artist has fallen off of the scaffolding because it's real common for us to paint and then want to step back and take a look at what we've created. In the case of the Sistine altar wall, Michelangelo fell off of the scaffolding while he was creating that. You know, he was okay. But the artist to the right, his name is Barna de Sienna, and he died from his fall. His assistant had to finish this painting of the Crucifixion. Now there's also a term you might come across called fresco secco, and this is painting on plaster that has already dried. And as you can imagine, it's nowhere near as permanent as true fresco is. And it's sometimes used for various reasons. One is to correct mistakes. If you accidentally make a mistake and, for instance, give an angel an extra finger on her hand, it's real easy just to paint over that instead of going through the process of chipping the plaster out, reapplying, and then matching the paint. If you're up against a deadline and traditional fresco painting would not have been applicable, then yeah, you're going to do some fresco secco, especially if you're up 40 feet in the sky painting the roof of a chapel and no one's going to know for 200 years that you did fresco secco. But this is what happens to paint when it peels away from the wall. If Leonardo da Vinci had done true fresco painting, and by the way, he was never trained in fresco, this would have been as beautiful as the Sistine altar wall or Sistine ceiling is today. But you can see it's kind of a ghostly form of itself. In fact, most of the paint here is from restoration efforts. So about 20% of the original paint remains on the Last Supper. And this is painting on dried plaster. And again, this is just what we would consider fresco secco. So I had mentioned patrons, and they are the people who pay for art during the Renaissance. It's a totally different world than it is today. You're not going to be able to go to a store and see already completed paintings. You know, if you're the Pope and you're not going to go down to the painting store and pick up 2 crucifixions and 1 Last Supper. You have to order these in advance and pay for them in advance, and the artist may take 6 months or a year to produce one of these. A lot of the more famous artists also work in workshops where a lot of the work is done by assistants that they're training. So when we look at who's paying for this art to be produced, number 1 is wealthy families. We have, of course, people like Enrico Scrovini, but we also have the Albizzi family, the Strazzis, the Brancaccis, and most importantly, particularly if you study the Renaissance, you're going to learn about the Medici family. We also have the Church as a major patron, and we have famous popes such as Benedict XII, Clement VI, Innocent VII, Leo X, who happens to be a member of the Medici family, and the person at the right, Pope Julius II, who is the person who calls Michelangelo to paint the Sistine ceiling, and who also brings Raphael to paint his personal apartments, where we get the fresco series that includes the School of Athens. We have the guilds, which are independent associations of bankers, merchants, artisans, manufacturers, similar in design to today's labor unions. The good thing for us is that they are extremely competitive, wanting to prove that they are a more powerful guild than the next guild. And we also have civic bodies. And we don't see artwork being as frequently patronized by this group, but we have to consider they have done some very major projects, such as the statue of David by Michelangelo was paid for by the government of Florence. And in the image to the right, you see the Palazzo Vecchio, and the image of the statue of David was originally set right outside there. Now, I also want to point out that with the Palazzo Vecchio, just looking at this building lets you know how kind of warlike this time period was. This is a fortress-like building. There are no windows on the ground floor. We have the battlements up above, and that tower served kind of a dual purpose, not only to help locate the city, because it's about 300 feet high, but it's also a place that would serve as a prison. And we have a similar structure over in the city of Sienna. The most famous artist from Sienna was Duccio. And you can see here his work is again very flat and very frontal, very much like Cimabue's early work. And then we have the Sienna Cathedral, which is made from striped marble. When you go inside, it's absolutely stunning. And in the center of the church here, this is where the famous altarpiece by Duccio would have sat. And this is the Maesta. The Maesta is also called a polyptych, meaning that it's a multi-paneled altarpiece. There's 40 panels altogether in this work. And just to give you an idea of size, the panel in the center is roughly 8 feet high and 15 feet wide. And this is the flip side of the Maesta. I'm going to bring it back again to the front of it again, just to tell you a little bit more about it. When it was finished, there was a processional, basically a parade, from the artist's workshop to the church, which was about 3 miles away. And the city closed down for the day so that people could attend. I have a small quote from the time period. It says, accompanied by members of the government, the clergy, and the people carrying lighted candles and torches to the sound of all the bells of the city and the music of trumpets and bagpipes. This altarpiece was a big deal, and it stood in the Sienna Cathedral for 200 years. In 1506, it was taken down, and what's worse is, around 1550, no one could tell you where they had put it. It was lost for over 200 years. In 1771, it was found, it was dismantled, and it was sold. So you have panels of this altarpiece throughout the world. In fact, in Washington, D.C., at the National Gallery, that's where 3 of the panels are. Now, a lot of them have been returned. Unfortunately, there are a lot of replicas and reproductions put here. But again, just a fantastic altarpiece. And to give you an idea of comparison between the artist Duccio and Giotto, we have the same scene here, which is the raising of Lazarus. So you can see they're very identical in terms of composition. And here we have the Annunciation by Simone Martini and Lippo Mimi. And this is a large work. It's about 9 feet by 10 feet, a lot of gold, and it's really a wonderful image. The story comes from the book of Luke, where the angel Gabriel says that Mary is going to bear the Christ child, and she says, "Hark, I am the handmaiden of the Lord." This is what we would consider a triptych. Now, the Maesta is a polyptych. It has many panels to it. However, here it just has 3. The center panel, where the Annunciation is taking place, and then we have a left panel and a right panel. So when we have 3 panels, this is what's called a triptych, and it's something that is very, very common. To give you an idea of some artworks that are outside of Italy, we have this work from the Cathedral of Saint-Denis in France. And this is the Virgin and Child. It's only about 2 feet in terms of height, and it is a reliquary. That means that it holds a relic from the saint. And here it's basically the fleur-de-lis. You pull it back, it opens up, and inside is supposed to be strands of Mary's hair. The base contains 14 separate scenes from Christ's infancy and passion, along with statues of prophets in between. A much more rougher sculpture, this is a Pietà, basically, Mary mourning over the dead body of Christ. This is from Germany. It's a little bit larger, about 3 feet in height. And I want to go through a couple of the terms from the study guides, as they're going to play a role later on. We have illuminated manuscripts, which if you've taken Survey 1 with me, you know that this is a heavily decorated page of religious text. We have the altarpiece. And when we have 2 panels together, this is called a diptych. A 3-paneled altarpiece, a triptych, and then a multi-paneled altarpiece, polyptych. Tempera is the paint that we use to apply during this time period. Hieratic scale means that the largest person is the most important, usually helping to denote the focal point. Sometimes hieratic scale is called hierarchical scale or emphasis by scale. Mimesis means to replicate or reproduce, and in this case, artists are trying to reproduce nature. And our next lecture is going to be about art in Italy during the 1400s or the 15th century. We're going to be moving from the city of Padua and Sienna down to the Republic of Florence.